Look at a litter of puppies. 6, sometimes 8, all born in a single afternoon. Look at a nest of mice. A dozen pups, blind and pink, arriving within minutes of each other. Now look at a human birth. 1 baby, maybe 2, if something unusual happens. That's it. For a species that has spread across every continent, outcompeted every rival hominin, and built cities on ice and desert alike, this seems like an evolutionary mistake. Why would the most successful primate on the planet gamble its entire future on a single offspring at a time? The answer isn't about weakness. It's about a trade-off so extreme it nearly didn't work, and understanding it means going back further than you'd think. Back before humans, before primates, before mammals even had the option to choose. Reproduction is a numbers game. Every species that has ever existed is running the same calculation. How many offspring, at what size, with what odds of survival? There are 2 basic strategies. Flood the system with quantity and let the odds do the work, or invest everything into a small number of offspring and protect that investment fiercely. Biologists call this R selection versus K selection, and mammals sit almost entirely on the K selection end of that spectrum. Fewer young, more care, longer development. But even within mammals, there's a massive range. A rabbit can produce dozens of offspring a year. A human can produce, at most, 1 every 9 months. And realistically, 1 every 2 to 3 years across a lifetime. Something pushed humans to the absolute extreme edge of that spectrum, and it wasn't diet, and it wasn't climate. It was the brain. Around 2 million years ago, the hominin brain began an expansion unlike anything seen before in mammalian evolution. Homo habilis, then Homo erectus, then eventually Homo sapiens. Each iteration carrying a larger skull, a denser tangle of neurons, a more energetically expensive organ sitting on top of the spine. And that expansion created a problem that had no clean solution. A bigger brain needs a bigger skull to protect it. A bigger skull needs to pass through the birth canal. And the birth canal is constrained by the pelvis, which has to remain narrow enough for bipedal walking to work efficiently. This is what anthropologists call the obstetrical dilemma, and it is not a minor inconvenience. It is a direct structural conflict between 2 of the traits that made humans human, big brains and upright walking, both competing for the same anatomical space. Evolution doesn't get to redesign the skeleton from scratch. It works with what's already there, and what was already there was a pelvis shaped for efficient bipedal locomotion, refined over millions of years since Australopithecus first stood upright. Widening that pelvis dramatically to accommodate a fully developed infant skull would have made walking and running less efficient. And for a species that survived through persistence hunting and long-distance travel across open terrain, that inefficiency could be fatal. So natural selection found a different solution. Instead of widening the exit, it narrowed what came out. Human babies are born with brains at roughly 25% of their adult size. Chimpanzees, by comparison, are born with brains already at 40% of adult size. Humans are the least neurologically finished mammal at birth, relative to what we eventually become. This is why a human infant can't lift its own head, can't regulate its own temperature, can't do almost anything a newborn gazelle or newborn chimp can do within hours of birth. We are, biologically speaking, still fetuses on the outside, finishing a developmental process that should have happened in the womb. And that single trade-off, 1 skull, 1 birth canal, 1 impossible geometry problem, is the reason for almost everything that follows. Because once you accept that human infants must be born radically underdeveloped, you also accept that they require years of intensive, dedicated care before they can survive independently. And a mother caring for 1 helpless infant simply cannot simultaneously care for a second or a third. There's no spare attention, no spare milk, no spare arms. Litters work for species whose offspring are largely self-sufficient within days or weeks. Litters do not work for a species whose offspring require a decade or more before reaching anything close to independence. Here's where the story gets more interesting, though, because a narrow pelvis and an underdeveloped infant only explain why humans can't have litters. They don't fully explain why humans don't even manage twins regularly, the way some other primates do. And this is where energy enters the equation. Pregnancy in humans is metabolically brutal. Carrying a single fetus to term already increases a mother's energy expenditure by roughly 20%. The human placenta is unusually invasive, aggressively drawing resources from maternal blood supply to feed a rapidly growing brain that consumes, even before birth, a staggering proportion of total fetal energy. Now imagine trying to run that system twice, simultaneously, inside a body that evolved to support exactly one. Twin pregnancies in humans carry dramatically higher risks, higher rates of premature birth, lower birth weights, higher maternal complications. For most of human evolutionary history, in an environment without hospitals, without cesarean sections, without neonatal care, a twin pregnancy was far more likely to end in the death of the mother, both infants, or all three, than a singleton pregnancy was. Natural selection ran this experiment continuously for hundreds of thousands of years, across millions of births, and the outcome was consistent. Mothers who carried one high-investment offspring at a time survived at higher rates and successfully raised more children over their lifetime than mothers who gambled on carrying two. But this raises an obvious question. If big brains created such a dangerous bottleneck, why didn't evolution just stop making brains bigger? The answer is that the payoff was worth the risk, and worth it by an enormous margin. Every other adaptation available to a mid-sized, physically unremarkable primate, without claws, without great speed, without natural armor, depended entirely on cognitive advantage. Tool use, coordinated hunting, fire, language, complex social bonds, all of it traces back to that expensive, dangerous, oversized brain. A species that solved the birth canal problem by simply staying dumber would have been outcompeted by every environmental pressure it faced. So evolution didn't choose safety. It chose intelligence, and it paid for that choice with the most extreme, high-risk reproductive strategy of any primate on Earth. And this is where human social structure enters the picture. Because a single mother, alone, raising a single infant that takes over a decade to become self-sufficient, cannot survive the arithmetic by herself. This is the foundation of what anthropologists call cooperative breeding, or more specifically in human evolution, the grandmother hypothesis and alloparenting. Unlike almost every other great ape, humans routinely raise offspring with help. Fathers who stay involved, older siblings who help care for younger ones, grandmothers, critically, who in most primate species die shortly after their own reproductive years end, but in humans live for decades afterward, providing childcare, food gathering, and knowledge transfer that dramatically increases the survival odds of grandchildren. Human reproduction was never actually designed to be a solo project. The single infant strategy only works because an entire support network absorbs the burden that a litter-bearing mammal would otherwise carry alone through sheer numbers. Compare this to chimpanzees, our closest living relative, who also typically have single births, but space them 4 to 6 years apart, and who receive dramatically less cooperative support from male partners and extended family than human mothers typically do. Humans compressed that spacing down to roughly 2 to 3 years by distributing the caregiving load across a wider group, something almost no other great ape does at scale. The single offspring strategy, combined with a village-level support structure, allowed humans to actually increase reproductive output compared to their closest relatives, despite each individual pregnancy being riskier and each individual infant being more helpless. So the single birth isn't a limitation forced onto humans by biology. It's the specific price paid for the trait that made every other human achievement possible. Every large brain born into every generation required a narrow escape through an impossibly tight anatomical bottleneck, one infant at a time, one impossibly underdeveloped skull at a time, surviving only because an entire cooperative network was standing by to catch what evolution left unfinished. The next time you see a litter of puppies born in a single afternoon, remember that your own species gave up that option entirely, on purpose, in exchange for something evolution apparently decided was worth even more. A brain complex enough to eventually ask why.